Hey, this is Jay with Vintage Auto Garage, and I'm here to talk about gauge reducers and connecting up gauge reducers to your vehicle. So I want to talk about kind of the evolution of our business. So, we started the business over 15 years ago now. We started with this V-Reg, which is a small little device. 12 volts in, 6 volts out, run oil, gas, temp gauges. And it worked pretty good as long as you weren't operating in too hot a climate. Because these would have a tendency to thermally shut off. So our next evolution of gauge reducer was this one, which was essentially the same size, but it had these little fins on it, and the little fins were to disperse the heat. Okay, now all of these that I'm going to show you are all solid state devices. They're not resistors. Let me just talk about that for a minute. You don't want to use a resistor of any kind on your gauges because resistors are not very accurate. Despite what you might read out there on the internet, that a resistor, as it gets hot, the value will change, and as the value changes, then your gauge is not going to read correctly. So what you want when you're going to change your car from 6 to 12 volts, and you're going to use your original oil, gas, and temp gauges, you want a reducer that's solid state, that has a continuous output voltage. So we'll sometimes refer to these as a voltage reducer regulator. And the reason why it's a regulator, because it regulates the voltage. So it's a constant voltage out, because you don't want the voltage to fluctuate up and down as the output of the alternator or generator, because that will cause the gauge to flutter and fluctuate. So essentially what these all do is it has 12 volts in with a constant 6 volts out. Okay. Now we say these are 6 volt outputs, so let me just clarify something. A 6 volt car doesn't run on 6 volts. It runs really on 8 volts because the generator had to generate 2 more volts to charge that 6 volt battery. So everything in the car was really built to run on 8 volts. Okay. A 12 volt car is not actually a 12 volt car, it's a 14 volt car. So, because it needs 2 more volts in addition to charge the battery. Okay, so the alternator puts out about 14.1 volts. And so really the voltage going into any of these gauge reducer regulator is around 14.1, okay? And then it actually puts out 8 volts that'll operate your gauge. Okay, so these gauges typically run on 8 volts. That's why you'll see some guys, what we used to do was, cars didn't start well on 6 volts, and put an 8 volt battery, and an 8 volt battery will work just fine. The only problem with that is you can't charge an 8 volt battery with a 6 volt generator. It doesn't put out enough. So a little history. So this was the first evolution of the V-Reg, the second one, and then this one came along a few years later, and this was greatly improved. It has a aluminum housing, has a little LED light in here with a circuit breaker. It's a self-resetting circuit breaker, and this we shipped this device for several years, probably 5 or 6 years. This is our latest version of the V-Reg. So this is the MGR1. It's essentially the same as this, except the housing is smaller because the processor that we use in this is different. It doesn't put out as much heat. It has 2 LED lights instead of just the one. And in the instructions, it tells you if the green light's on or the red light's on, which one to check. So basically will tell you if you have a problem on the input side or the output side. This one didn't. It just told you what the LED light just said, whether it was on or off. So if there was power to it, the green light was on. This one will actually tell you how to troubleshoot if you got a problem, okay? So in addition to being a voltage reducer regulator, it also has got good gauge protection. So, you know, all of these had that essentially. So if you had, you know, transient spikes and voltage and that kind of thing, gauges don't like that. And the construction of a gauge is a very small, thin, almost thread-like wire. And if you put too much current on that, or voltage, you're going to burn them out, and they're not easy to find, and they're not easy to get rewound. So highly recommend, if you're going to change your car from 6 to 12 volts, or you got 6-volt gauges and you're going to, you know, run 12 volts, you pick one of these up, because this will give you the protection. It's simple to install, and essentially kind of bulletproof. It's got two connector, or two holes here, so you can connect it, screw it onto, you know, any place up under the dash. These do not get hot. These just get warm. So I mean, you can hold on to these when they're in operation. So they're not hot, so you don't have to, you know, put them in a well ventilated area like you do like heater motor reducers and radio reducers. Those are resistors. And the way you get rid of voltage is essentially through heat. But being a solid state device, they actually don't put out that much heat. Okay, so this is the multi-gauge. This will run oil, gas, and temp. This is our single gauge reducer. So we developed this because there were many car manufacturers that only had one electric gauge. So they had essentially just a gas gauge that was electric. So the oil and the temp were mechanical, meaning that they had little lines or tubes, mechanical tubes that came from the engine out to the gauge. So there was no electrical connection. So some cars have the temp is electric and the gas is electric, and some are just the gas is electric and the oil and the temp are mechanical. So you can use either one of these, whichever one you want to use, but this is what would be one if say you had a Dodge truck, and it just has one single gas gauge, or a Chevrolet has just one gas gauge, then you would use this. The ones made by Vintage Auto Garage are different than the ones that you're going to see out in the marketplace. And you'll be able to tell that it's made by Vintage Auto Garage because it has red shrink wrap. And if you peel that back, the circuit board says Vintage Auto Garage on it. We make these here in this country, so these are not an import. These do not come from offshore. Some things that make this difference is that this is a brass connection, and brass is a really good conductive of not only electricity but also getting rid of heat. Most of them that you're going to find are not brass. You're going to find they're steel bolts, which do not get rid of heat as well as this, because again, you're going to get a little heat in this, and you got to get rid of that heat someplace. So that heat's going to come off of this, all right? And then also where it's connected to the gauge, all right? So that gauge will also act as a heat sink. Super simple to hook up. You just hook this to the positive side of the gauge, all right? Screw that on there. This black wire is the ground. You want to ground it. You want to make sure it's grounded well. If it's not grounded, it's not going to work. And that is all. That's not going to fit. I mean, that's essentially it. That's the way that's installed. So the 12 volt goes on here. This is the 6 volt. This is the ground, and there you have it. If this ground isn't connected correctly, or it's not a good ground, you're not going to get any reduction of voltage. So it takes a ground to do that. These are solid state devices, so they will only work on negative ground systems. Okay, all of these will only work on negative ground systems. So it doesn't matter whether you have if you have this one or this one. 12 volts, negative ground, not positive ground. Okay. Same thing with this one, 12 volt negative ground. All anything solid state today, whether it's your GPS unit, your cell phone charger, your brand new radio, they're all negative ground. Everything is standard on a negative ground. Okay, so that's the single gauge reducer. Very simple. Comes with a good set of instructions. All these come with a good set of instructions. So one last thing before we go, I want to talk about hooking up your alternator to your amp meter. Okay, so this is our 10 gauge 10 AWG wire that comes from the alternator. So this connects on the back of the alternator, and then this goes over the battery. Remember, an alternator takes 12 volts to make it work. All right, so this needs to be connected. You'll always want to connect this with a fuse. So the way many of these old cars worked in terms of the amp gauge, remember the amp gauge is not, it's not a voltage gauge, so you're not going to connect a voltage reducer to an amp gauge. The amp gauge is going to measure current, okay? So it's not measuring voltage, it's measuring the current or the force of the electricity. So the way this one worked was it had a loop on the back, and that you put that wire, so you come off that alternator, you go through this loop, and then that other side of this goes over to the plus side of the battery, okay? So then it reads the current back and forth between the battery and the alternator, or the alternator to the battery, okay? And then that's what swings the needle back and forth. It's really simple. Later amp meters had actually connection on it. So you would, if you wanted to use this amp meter in your car with your new alternator, and you had a 100 amp alternator, I'm going to say it's okay, because it's only going to, it doesn't mean because you have a 100 amp alternator, all 100 amps is going to run through this. The only thing that's going to run through it is what the current that your car is drawing. So if you turn on all your lights and everything is running and your car, let's say, draws 35, 40 amps, well, that's all that's going to go through this amp meter, right? Because it's only going to be what the draw is. Now you start adding radiator fans and you start adding air conditioning units, airbag systems, big high power stereos, you're going to end up needing bigger alternators. And in that case, you don't want to run one of these big alternators. And when I say a big alternator, I'm saying anything over 100 amps. So if you got 140, 160, we have 177 amp hairpins, we got 220 amp alternators. And as folks put more and more electrical components in these cars, the alternators have gotten to get bigger. Plus, this wire has to get bigger. You don't want to run it through these poor little amp meters that were meant to run like 30 amps, 40 amps. I mean, they were never built for that. So what we recommend is don't use this when you're installing a high-powered, anything over 100 amp alternator. We don't recommend using this. We recommend getting a voltmeter and putting that voltmeter, somewhere under the dash, and it's easy to connect. One side just goes to switch power, so when you turn the key switch on, the other side goes to ground, and you'll be able to see actually what the alternator's putting out. So, an alternator, when it's charging right and everything's working, it's going to be somewhere around 14 volts. If you want an amp meter, you can go get an aftermarket amp meter. Again, you can put that in a cluster, you can put that underneath the dash, and then you would wire this up, the amp meter, to the way the manufacturer recommends, okay? So just a kind of a word on, a lot of times we get calls on how to hook this amp meter up. Do we use one of these? And the answer is no, you don't. You don't need to reduce the voltage to an amp meter because it's not voltage. Okay, so hopefully this was informative, and if you need to reach us, we're at www.vintageautogarage.com, and my name is Jay, and thanks for watching.